A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
So, I was looking at a map the other day, and it hit me how much our mental geography is still stuck in the 1950s. We use these labels like developed and developing or global south as if they are hard scientific facts, but when you actually look at the data, the whole system is a total mess. It is like trying to navigate a modern city using a map from the horse and buggy era.
It is a mess, and it is a fascinating one. Herman Poppleberry here, and I have been waiting for us to really tear into this. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the shifting taxonomies we use to categorize nations, and honestly, the deeper you go, the more you realize these labels are often more about political leverage and trade perks than they are about actual reality on the ground. We are living in March of 2026, and yet we are still using vocabulary that was designed for a world that simply does not exist anymore.
It is funny you say that, because I was reading about the turkey paradox. This is the perfect example of the inconsistency we are talking about. Depending on who you ask, Turkey is either a sophisticated developed nation or a risky emerging market. The United Nations Human Development Index puts them in the very high human development category, basically calling them developed. But then you look at the big financial indexes, like Dow Jones or FTSE, and they are still stuck in the emerging category. It is like the country is in two different centuries at the same time, depending on which spreadsheet you are looking at.
That is the perfect place to start because it highlights the friction between social metrics and financial ones. If you are an investor, you care about market volatility, currency stability, and institutional transparency. If you are the United Nations, you care about literacy rates, life expectancy, and mean years of schooling. But before we get into the weeds of 2026, we have to look at where this all started. Most people do not realize that the whole concept of the three worlds was essentially a metaphor that got out of hand.
Right, Alfred Sauvy, 1952. He was a French demographer who wrote an article called Three Worlds, One Planet. He basically looked at the world and saw the three estates of pre-revolutionary France. You had the first estate, the clergy, which became the capitalist West, the United States, Western Europe, Japan. The second estate, the nobility, became the Soviet bloc and the communist East. And then the third estate, the commoners, became the third world. His point was that the third world was ignored and exploited, but wanted to become something.
And just like the third estate in France, Sauvy was arguing that this third world was the majority of humanity. But then the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and the second world just vanished from the map. Suddenly, we were left with a first world and a third world, which makes no sense if you are counting. It is like having a top floor and a basement, but no middle of the house. That is why the term third world feels so dated and, frankly, a bit pejorative now. It implies a hierarchy of value rather than a state of development.
But we replaced it with developing, which is not much better. It is teleological. It assumes every country is on the same conveyor belt, heading toward the exact same destination of Western-style industrialization. It is like saying a teenager is just a developing adult, which misses the fact that the teenager has their own unique identity and goals. What if a country does not want to develop in that specific way? Or what if they are actually regressing? We do not have a polite word for a country that is undeveloping.
We use fragile states for that now, which used to be called failed states, until people realized that was a bit too harsh for diplomatic circles. But you are right about the labels being imprecise. Look at the International Monetary Fund. They have a very specific set of criteria for what they call advanced economies. It is not just about how much money you have in the vault. They look at your per capita income, sure, but they also look at export diversification. This is why you have these oil-rich Gulf states that are incredibly wealthy, But the IMF still classifies them as emerging or developing because 70% of their exports are just one thing. If you are a one-trick pony, you are not advanced in their eyes.
That feels like a bit of a snub, doesn't it? If you have a sovereign wealth fund worth trillions, but the IMF says you are not advanced because you sell too much oil, it shows that these classifications are really about the resilience of the system, not just the balance in the bank account. It is about whether your economy can survive a shock to a single commodity.
It is about financial integration too. To be advanced in the eyes of the IMF, you have to be deeply woven into the global financial fabric. You have to have a certain level of transparency and institutional maturity. But then you look at the World Bank and they keep it much simpler. They just look at gross national income per capita and put you in one of four boxes: low, lower middle, upper middle, or high income. They update those boxes every July, and it is a huge deal for these countries because those labels determine if you can get low interest concessional loans. If you graduate from lower middle to upper middle, you might actually lose access to the cheapest money.
This is where the classification arbitrage comes in, isn't it? Countries actually have an incentive to stay in a lower category to keep the perks. I mean, look at China. This is the one that always blows my mind. China is the second largest economy on the planet. They are lead actors in space exploration, artificial intelligence, and high-speed rail. Yet, at the World Trade Organization, they still insist on being called a developing country.
It is a brilliant bit of strategic positioning. By maintaining that developing status at the WTO, China gets to keep certain trade flexibilities and longer transition periods for implementing agreements. They get what is called special and differential treatment. They're essentially acting like a global superpower while claiming the legal protections of a struggling startup. It drives the United States and the European Union crazy, especially with the trade stance we have seen since the start of 2025.
It is the ultimate gaming of the system. You have got a country that can outspend almost anyone on military hardware, but when it comes to trade rules, they're like, sorry, we are just a poor country trying to find our way. It really highlights how these labels are not just descriptive, they are functional tools for economic warfare. And the UNIDO reports from 2024 and 2025 show that this debate is only getting more heated. Everyone is trying to redefine the criteria to suit their own industrial policy.
And it is not just China. You have this whole rising class of what people are calling middle powers. Think of Indonesia, Brazil, Turkey, or South Korea. These are nations that do not fit into the old developed versus developing binary. They are rejecting the idea that they have to pick a side between the G7 and the BRICS Plus bloc. They are carving out a third way that is much more transactional and pragmatic.
I love the term middle power because it sounds so much more active. It is not about where you are on a ladder, it is about how much weight you can throw around. Indonesia is a great example. They have a massive population, a growing economy, and they are basically telling both Washington and Beijing that they will work with whoever gives them the best deal on nickel processing or infrastructure. They are not waiting for a label from the World Bank to tell them they have arrived. They are acting as the swing states of the global order.
The rise of BRICS Plus has completely upended the old stratification. We are talking about a group that now includes Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. If you look at their combined gross domestic product in terms of purchasing power parity, they are sitting at around $60 trillion. That actually surpasses the G7. 50% of the global population is represented in that bloc. That is a massive shift in the gravity of the world economy.
But is it actually a coherent bloc? Because when the trade wars really kicked off in 2025, we did not see the BRICS nations standing together like some kind of unified front. We saw them all running to Washington to cut their own bilateral deals. It felt like the label of BRICS Plus was a lot stronger on paper than it was in a crisis.
You hit on the core weakness of that classification. The G7 is relatively coherent because it is based on a shared set of liberal democratic values and a long history of security cooperation. BRICS Plus is a collection of countries that often have very little in common other than a shared grievance against the Western-led financial system. You have India and China in the same group, and they literally have border skirmishes. You have Iran and the United Arab Emirates. It is a group of rivals who want to hedge their bets. The International Institute for Strategic Studies published a report in July of 2025 that basically said strategic non-alignment is the new default, but it is incredibly fragile.
It is like a group of people who all hate the same landlord but can't agree on how to run the building themselves. And then you have the term Global South, which has become the fashionable way to describe this whole messy group. But as you always point out, the geography of the Global South makes absolutely no sense.
It is a political term, not a geographic one. If you look at a map, Australia and New Zealand are as far south as you can get, but they are firmly part of the global north because they are wealthy, English-speaking democracies. Meanwhile, India and Mexico are in the northern hemisphere, but they are the heart of the global south. It is basically a polite way of saying the post-colonial world. It is a term that carries a lot of historical and emotional weight, but for actual geopolitical analysis, it is often too broad to be useful.
It is like trying to use a sledgehammer to do surgery. If you lump Brazil and Ethiopia into the same category, you are missing almost everything that makes those two countries different. One is a massive industrial democracy with a sophisticated agricultural sector, and the other is a landlocked nation struggling with internal conflict and food security. Putting them both in the global south is almost a form of erasure. It ignores the specific challenges and strengths of each nation.
That is why the more serious foreign offices are moving toward what I think of as multi-modal analysis. They don't just look at one index. They look at Freedom House for governance, which uses 25 different indicators across a 0 to 100 scale to see if a country is free, partly free, or not free. Then they look at the Human Development Index to see how the people are actually living. And then they look at things like the Fragile States Index to see if the whole thing is about to blow up.
I remember we talked about this a bit in episode 1202, when we were discussing the decapitation doctrine, and how the era of long-term diplomatic off-ramps seems to be ending. If you can't rely on a country's classification to stay stable, then your whole foreign policy has to become much more reactive and granular. You can't just say, oh, they are a developing democracy, let's give them 10 years to figure it out. In 2026, you might not have 10 months.
The volatility is the key point. A country can move from an emerging market darling to a fragile state in a matter of months. Look at how quickly the narrative around certain Eastern European or South American nations shifts. This is why some analysts are pushing for a graph-based model of geopolitics, something we touched on way back in episode 662. Instead of putting countries in static tiers or boxes, you map the actual flows of energy, data, and capital between them.
That sounds way more realistic. It is about the connections, not the labels. If a country is a critical node in the global semiconductor supply chain, it doesn't really matter if the World Bank calls them lower middle income. They have systemic importance that far outweighs their per capita gross domestic product. It is about functional relevance. If you are the only person who knows how to fix the elevator, you are the most important person in the building, regardless of your job title.
And the middle powers know this. They are intentionally creating those dependencies. They are making themselves indispensable in specific niches so that they can't be ignored or bullied by the bigger blocs. It is a much more sophisticated game than the old Cold War version where you just picked a side and stayed there. Today, you might be in a security partnership with the United States but have your entire digital infrastructure built by Chinese firms.
So if I'm a listener trying to make sense of the news, and I see a headline about the global south or emerging economies, what should I actually be looking for? Because it feels like these terms are designed to oversimplify things for a quick soundbite.
The first takeaway is to treat any single label with extreme skepticism. If someone calls a country developing, ask yourself what they are trying to gain from that label. Is it China trying to avoid trade tariffs? Is it a non-governmental organization trying to raise funds? Is it a politician trying to frame a conflict as democracy versus autocracy? The label is often the argument, not the evidence.
So look for the divergence. Like the Turkey example, if the United Nations says they are developed but the banks say they are emerging, that gap is where the real story is. That gap tells you that the people are doing well in terms of health and education, but the institutions or the currency might be a mess. It is in the contradictions that you find the truth.
Precisely. And the second takeaway is to watch the middle powers. The real shifts in the next decade aren't going to come from the G7 or the core BRICS. They are going to come from countries like Vietnam, Poland, or Indonesia that are playing both sides and building their own regional networks. They are the ones breaking the old taxonomies. They are the ones who are proving that you don't have to be a superpower to be a major player.
It is like the world is moving from a rigid hierarchy to a messy, overlapping network. The old three worlds model was a ladder. The new model is a web, and it is a web where the strands are constantly being rewoven. It is much harder to draw a clean map of a web than it is to draw a ladder.
It is also worth looking at the governance metrics. Organizations like VDIM in Sweden or Freedom House provide a much better look at the internal health of a country than just looking at their gross domestic product growth. You can have a country that looks like an economic powerhouse but is rotting from the inside because of corruption or a lack of civil liberties. Eventually, those governance failures catch up with the economic numbers. We saw that repeatedly in the 2020s.
It is the difference between looking at a car's top speed and looking at its engine maintenance records. You might be going fast right now, but if the oil hasn't been changed in 3 years, you are going to break down on the highway. And in the current geopolitical climate, the highway is full of potholes.
The return of the Trump administration in 2025 has really hammered this home. Their approach to trade and diplomacy is much more transactional, which ignores a lot of the old sentimental classifications. They don't care if a country is a developing ally in the traditional sense. They care about the trade deficit and whether that country is supporting American interests in real time. It has forced a lot of nations to drop the labels and show their cards. The era of the participation trophy in international relations is officially over.
It is a very unsentimental way of looking at the world, which is probably why it has been so disruptive. It treats every nation as an individual actor rather than a member of a club. It is the end of the collective bargaining era for many of these blocs.
And it really is. And as we move further into 2026, I think we are going to see even more of these institutions like the United Nations Industrial Development Organization or the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development struggling to keep their classification systems relevant. They are publishing reports every year trying to tweak the criteria, but the reality is moving faster than the bureaucracy can handle. The world is changing in real time, and our spreadsheets are always 6 months behind.
It makes me wonder if we will eventually just give up on these broad categories entirely. If we will just have a massive real-time dashboard of every country's debt to gross domestic product, literacy rate, energy exports, and semiconductor output, and let people draw their own conclusions.
We are getting closer to that with AI-driven analysis. You can now process millions of data points to see the real-world behavior of a nation rather than relying on what their foreign office claims in a press release. The data is becoming more transparent, which makes the old political labels harder to maintain. If the data says you are a high-income, technologically advanced state, it is hard to keep claiming you are a poor developing nation at the trade table.
I think that is a good thing. The more we see the world as it actually is, rather than how we want it to fit into our 1950s mental maps, the better chance we have of actually solving global problems. If you are using the wrong map, you are never going to get to the right destination. You might think you are heading toward a peaceful harbor when you are actually sailing straight into a reef.
That is the perfect way to put it. The map is not the territory, and right now, the map is incredibly blurry. We have to be willing to look at the messy, contradictory data points if we want to understand the real power dynamics of this century. We have to be willing to admit that a country can be a superpower and a developing nation at the same time, or a wealthy democracy and a fragile state.
Well, this has been a deep dive into the weird world of nation shuffling. I feel like I need to go redraw my mental map of the world now, or at least throw out the old one and start over with a lot more gray areas and a lot fewer boxes.
The gray areas are where all the interesting stuff happens anyway. That is where the new alliances are being formed and the new rules are being written.
Very true. Well, that is our look at the shifting taxonomies of global power. Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes.
And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the research and generation of this show. We literally couldn't do this without that kind of specialized compute to process these massive datasets.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are finding these deep dives useful, leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. It really does help other people find the show and join the conversation.
We will see you in the next one.
Take care.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the close from sloth